The immortal queen of Neo-Verona could have her pick of gene-forged warlords, cybernetic aristocrats, or ageless titans of industry. Instead, she spent her evening watching a mid-level data archivist argue with a subway vending machine over a stale synthetic ham sandwich. High above the smog layer, the apex spire glittered like a diamond spear driven into the heart of the city. Inside the grand ballroom, the elite of Neo-Verona mingled under chandeliers of spun glass and localized anti-gravity fields. These were the sanguis. They were not creatures of myth or magic, but the ultimate terrifying result of late 21st century biotech hubris. Their ancestors had cracked the code to infinite cellular regeneration using specialized medical nanites. The only catch was that the nanites ran on a highly complex protein chain found exclusively in human blood. To survive, the sanguis consumed heavily refined, synthesized plasma served in crystal flutes. Parading their apex predator status while wrapped in bespoke silk and shimmering light weave fabric, Queen Elysia stood by a floor-to-ceiling smart glass window, her gaze fixed on the sprawling, neon-soaked labyrinth of the lower city. She wore a gown that seemed woven from liquid midnight, her posture projecting absolute, untouchable authority. She had ruled for 400 years. In that time, she had seen empires rise and fall, watched oceans dry up, and commanded legions in wars fought over breathable air and clean water. Tonight, however, she was simply bored. The assassin moved with the augmented grace of a high-end combat synthetic. He broke from the crowd, a cloaked monomolecular blade sliding from a hidden recess in his wrist. He was fast, his neural pathways likely overclocked with illegal military-grade stimulants. But to Elysia, he was moving through molasses. Before the blade could even breach her personal proximity field, Elysia pivoted. She did not flinch. She simply raised a hand, tapping into the biomagnetic stabilizers woven into her own nanite matrix. The air between them shimmered. The assassin's arm jerked wildly off course. The magnetic field of his own cybernetics turned against him. Elysia stepped inside his guard, her hand flashing forward to deliver a precise kinetic strike to his sternum. Ribs shattered instantly, driving inward to puncture his synthetic heart. The man collapsed in a heap of malfunctioning wiring and expensive tailoring. The string quartet across the room stopped playing. A few aristocrats gasped, more out of performative shock than actual fear. Elysia calmly produced a monogrammed silk handkerchief, wiped a solitary speck of dust from her knuckles, and signaled for her security detail to clear away the debris. It was the third assassination attempt this month. A rogue purist faction was getting desperate, testing her defenses, looking for any sign of weakness. They would find none. Yet, as she looked at the lifeless body being dragged away, Elysia felt an overwhelming sense of stagnation. Immortality had become a gilded cage, a never-ending cycle of political posturing and predictable violence. She turned away from the party, retreating to her private sanctum behind a set of heavy biometric blast doors. The moment the doors sealed, the facade of the untouchable sovereign melted away. She walked past holographic war tables and encrypted diplomatic terminals, approaching a small, customized surveillance console. With a flick of her wrist, the main screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across her pale, flawless features. The feed was coming from a stealth micro-drone, currently hovering in Sector 4 of the human residential zones, a place where the air tasted of ozone and cheap soy fry grease. The screen displayed Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was precisely, undeniably, and aggressively average. He had brown hair that refused to commit to a style, a slight slump in his shoulders from years of bad ergonomics, and a wardrobe that consisted almost entirely of muted gray corporate slacks and slightly wrinkled shirts. At this exact moment, Arthur was engaged in a furious, muttered debate with his holographic workstation. He was a data archivist third class at a municipal logistics firm, meaning his entire existence revolved around sorting corrupted delivery manifests for automated cargo haulers. Elysia leaned closer to the screen, her dark eyes tracking his every micro-expression. Arthur slapped the side of his monitor, hoping the percussive maintenance would fix the flickering blue screen of death. It did not. He sighed, a sound of profound, world-weary defeat, and slumped back in his synthetic leather chair. He rubbed his eyes, glanced at the digital clock hovering in the corner of his cubicle, and pulled a wrapped sandwich from his satchel. He unwrapped it with the grim determination of a man defusing a bomb, inspecting the limp, artificial lettuce and the questionable gray slab of synthetic meat. To the Queen of Neo-Verona, this was the most fascinating thing she had seen in a century. Her encrypted comms channel chimed. A holographic bust of Lord Silas materialized on a secondary monitor. Silas was a high-ranking member of the Immortal Council, a ruthless purist who believed humans were nothing more than livestock and that the sanguis should rule with an iron fist rather than from the shadows. He was impeccably dressed, his fangs subtly extended in a display of dominance. He began to speak, offering a thinly veiled compliment about her handling of the assassin, undoubtedly probing to see if the attack had rattled her. Elysia muted him instantly. She did not dismiss the projection, leaving him gesturing silently in the corner of her vision, entirely ignored. Her attention remained anchored to Arthur. Why him? The question had plagued her inner circle for weeks, ever since she ordered the elite Royal Intelligence Division to pivot their satellite arrays to monitor a human whose biggest daily challenge was the notoriously unreliable Sector 4 subway schedule. They assumed Arthur was a master spy, a sleeper agent, or a key player in an underground resistance movement. They were wrong. Arthur was completely oblivious. He had no criminal record, no political affiliations, and his most recent online search history consisted of looking up ways to remove coffee stains from polyester. Elysia tapped a command on her console, pulling up a highly classified overlay alongside the visual feed. The screen populated with Arthur's biometric data, heart rate, blood pressure, cellular respiration, but it was the deep scan genetic readout that held her focus. The sanguis were dying. It was a fiercely guarded state secret, whispered only in the darkest corners of the apex spire. The medical nanites that granted them eternal youth were degrading. After centuries of replication, the code was fraying, suffering from microscopic copy errors. They called it the fading. First came a dulling of the senses, then creeping paranoia, and finally a violent, irreversible cellular collapse. The Immortals were slowly going insane, their flawless bodies consuming themselves from the inside out. Lord Silas and his faction believed the answer was to consume raw, pure human blood in massive quantities, treating the lower city as an all-you-can-eat buffet. Elysia knew that would only lead to a genocidal war they could not win. They needed a stabilizer, a way to patch the degrading code. On the screen, Arthur took a bite of his sad gray sandwich and immediately grimaced, reaching for a lukewarm cup of water. Hidden deep within his entirely unremarkable DNA, buried beneath generations of genetic drift, was an anomaly, a dormant enzyme produced in his bone marrow. It was the biological equivalent of a master key, the only known compound capable of resetting the sanguis nanite matrix and halting the fading. Elysia had spent fortunes running discrete blood screenings through the municipal health databases, hunting for a match. Arthur was the only one. Elysia watched him meticulously fold his sandwich wrapper into a tiny, perfect triangle before tossing it into the recycling chute. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her mouth. He was entirely unaware that he was the most valuable biological asset on the planet. He was completely ignorant of the invisible crosshairs resting on his back, or the fact that an immortal queen was currently memorizing the way he nervously tapped his pen when a spreadsheet failed to load. She could easily send a tactical team to extract him. They could kick down his apartment door, bag his head, and drag him into a sterile subterranean laboratory where he would spend the rest of his natural life hooked up to a plasma centrifuge. That was exactly what Lord Silas would do if he discovered the boy's secret. But Elysia hesitated. For the first time in centuries, a cold, calculated variable had been disrupted by raw curiosity. She did not just want his biology. She wanted to understand how a creature so fragile, so weighed down by mundane anxieties and financial dread, could possess a resilience the immortals had long since lost. She reached out, tracing the outline of Arthur's face on the glowing monitor. The time for observation was rapidly coming to an end. The fading was accelerating within her own body, a cold ache settling deep in her bones. Silas was growing bolder, his assassins getting closer. She needed Arthur Penhaligon, and she needed him before the wolves of the Apex Spire picked up his scent. She stood up, the liquid midnight fabric of her gown shifting around her legs. It was time to leave the ivory tower. It was time to pay Sector 4 a visit. The rain in Sector 4 did not fall. It congealed, dripping from the rusty underbelly of the upper city like cold, industrial sweat. Into this chemical drizzle stepped the most powerful entity on the planet, perfectly disguised as a mid-level accounting assistant who had just survived a 12-hour shift. Elysia pulled the collar of her cheap synthetic polymer jacket tighter around her neck. It was an atrocious garment, stiff and smelling faintly of industrial sealant, but it served its purpose. It hid the lethal grace of her posture and the faint, luminescent glow of her high-grade subdermal wiring. For the first time in a century, the Queen of Neo-Verona was entirely off the grid, navigating the labyrinthine alleys of the lower districts without a security detail or an armored transport. Her destination was a subterranean establishment called the Neon Lotus, a cramped noodle bar wedged between a failing laundromat and a counterfeit cybernetics clinic. The air inside was thick with steam, smelling aggressively of sodium, rendered artificial fat, and damp wool. It was a place designed for quick, anonymous consumption, filled with exhausted corporate drones seeking temporary refuge from the crushing weight of their municipal debt. Elysia scanned the room, her optical implants instantly processing the threat level of every patron. 0. They were all completely harmless, beaten down by the system she oversaw. In the far corner, hunched over a steaming bowl of synthetic ramen, sat Arthur Penhaligon. Elysia approached his table, her movements calculated to mimic the heavy, lethargic shuffle of the working class. The bar was packed, offering the perfect excuse. She stopped opposite Arthur, gesturing to the empty plastic stool across from him. Arthur looked up, a strand of artificial kelp dangling from his chopsticks. He blinked, registering the soaked, thoroughly miserable-looking woman standing before him. He gestured to the stool with a quick nod, returning his attention to his meal. Elysia sat down. The plastic stool groaned under her. She placed her hands flat on the sticky laminate table, suddenly acutely aware of her own awkwardness. Ruling an empire of immortal predators required absolute ruthlessness. Sharing a table with a tired data archivist required social nuances she had long since discarded. A battered service drone rolled over, depositing a bowl of murky broth in front of her before trundling away. Elysia stared at it. To a sanguis whose palate was calibrated for highly refined, genetically synthesized plasma, the meal looked like toxic runoff. Arthur caught her expression and offered a sympathetic half-smile. He swallowed his mouthful and pointed a chopstick at her bowl. He told her not to look too closely at the protein cubes, noting that if you just swallow them whole, You do not have to taste the despair. Elysia slowly picked up the wooden utensils. She remarked, her tone utterly flat, that the culinary standards of this sector appeared to violate several historical treaties on biological warfare. Arthur let out a sharp, genuine laugh. He told her she must be from the compliance division, stating that nothing breeds dark humor quite like auditing municipal sludge. He leaned forward, clearly eager for a distraction from his own bleak routine. He introduced himself, extending a hand that was calloused from typing rather than combat. Elysia hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. His skin was warm, radiating a fragile, frantic biological heat that her own perfectly regulated body lacked. She introduced herself as Elle, claiming she worked in data redistribution. Arthur immediately launched into a passionate, highly detailed grievance about his day. He vented about his supervisor, a man named Henderson who had officially reprimanded him for being 4 minutes late. Arthur explained that the magnetic rail system had suffered a catastrophic power failure, trapping him in a tunnel with 40 other people breathing recycled air. But Henderson still docked his pay. Elysia processed this information. She calculated the exact amount of kinetic force required to crush Henderson's windpipe, concluding it would take less than 3 seconds to solve Arthur's problem permanently. She offered this solution aloud, suggesting that the permanent removal of this Henderson would instantly optimize the department's workflow. Arthur laughed again, harder this time, completely misunderstanding her lethal sincerity. He told her she was ruthless, joking that if she ran the department, they might actually get their artificial sunlight quotas increased. He sighed, stirring his noodles aimlessly. He explained that his apartment block had just raised the subscription fee for the UV panels, meaning he would have to choose between actual vitamin D and paying for premium bandwidth to access the historical archives. The immortal sovereign of the planet experienced a profound moment of cognitive dissonance. She controlled the orbital mirror arrays that directed sunlight across the globe. She shifted solar energy to power entire continental grids. The concept of budgeting for sunlight, of treating a fundamental celestial resource as a premium cable package, was entirely alien to her. She asked, genuinely baffled, why he did not simply requisition a personal solar array from the planetary reserves. Arthur gave her a look of pure, unadulterated amusement. He asked what planetary reserve she was talking about, playfully suggesting she had been breathing in too much printer toner. He stated that on his salary, the only array he was requisitioning was a slightly less broken desk lamp, while Arthur continued to lament the extortionate pricing of synthetic citrus. Elysia activated the covert biometric scanner embedded in her left contact lens. A faint, invisible beam of localized radiation swept across the table, penetrating Arthur's skin and mapping his cellular structure in real time. Data cascaded down the edge of her vision in a stream of emerald light. Heart rate steady, cholesterol slightly elevated, musculature underdeveloped. But deep within the marrow of his sternum, the scanner locked onto the prize, the anomaly. The enzyme was there, glowing like a beacon in the digital readout. It was pure, uncontaminated by the environmental toxins that plagued the lower city. Elysia felt a sudden sharp ache deep within her own chest. It was the fading, the microscopic decay of her own immortal nanites, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. The pain was a daily companion, a terrifying reminder that her perfect existence had an expiration date. Yet, sitting precisely 3 feet away from this oblivious, complaining human, the ache lessened. The sheer proximity to his biological frequency was already acting as a soothing balm to her fractured cellular code. He was not just a medical curiosity. He was the anchor that could keep her from plunging into the abyss. But acquiring him smoothly was no longer an option, because Elysia was not the only one making moves in the dark. Far above the chemical rain, in a heavily shielded data crypt beneath the apex spire, Lord Silas stood over a glowing tactical holomap. His perfectly symmetrical face was tight with suppressed rage. His own nanites were degrading faster than anticipated, causing a violent tremor in his left hand that he hid behind his back. He had reviewed the security logs from the gala. Elysia had slipped the net. She had bypassed the primary surveillance grid, leaving behind a perfectly looped holographic decoy in her private chambers. The Queen was missing, and Silas smelled vulnerability. A sovereign did not vanish into the lower slums unless she was hiding something, or seeking something she desperately needed. Silas turned to his chief technician, a heavily augmented cyborg wired directly into the room's mainframe. He demanded a full sweep of the lower sectors, ordering the deployment of the Null Hounds. The technician hesitated, reminding Silas that deploying military-grade tracking assets into a civilian zone would violate the Concordat. Silas closed the distance between them with terrifying speed, his hand snapping out to grip the technician's throat. The tremor in his hand vanished, replaced by crushing, mechanical force. He lifted the cyborg inches off the floor, stating with cold, echoing finality that the Concordat only applied to those who intended to let the Queen survive the night. He dropped the gasping technician and barked the order again, deep within the subterranean transit tunnels. Steel doors ground open. 4 sleek, quadrupedal machines stepped out of the darkness. They were a nightmare fusion of synthetic muscle and carbon fiber plating, their heads entirely featureless save for a cluster of glowing thermal optic sensors. They were programmed to track the unique energy signature of Elysia's specific nanite matrix, a scent they could follow through a hurricane. They moved with absolute silence, their razor-sharp claws leaving deep gouges in the concrete as they surged forward, ascending toward Sector 4. Back in the Neon Lotus, Arthur reached across the table to grab a napkin, his hand accidentally brushing against Elysia's knuckles. A localized static shock snapped between them. It was not a metaphor. The air crackled with a tiny burst of blue energy. Arthur yanked his hand back with a startled yelp, shaking his fingers. He muttered an apology, blaming the cheap static weave of his uniform. Elysia stared at her hand. Her subdermal wiring was practically singing, the corrupted nanites screaming in temporary blissful stabilization. The reaction was far more volatile than her scientists had predicted. His biology was violently incompatible with the slow decay of her world. Arthur wiped his mouth, oblivious to the fact that he had just inadvertently cured a microfraction of an Immortal's terminal disease. He looked at his wrist chronometer and groaned, announcing that his break was over and he had to return to the archives before Henderson logged a second infraction. He stood up, throwing a few physical credit chips onto the table. He smiled at her, a genuine, unburdened expression that felt entirely out of place in the damp gloom of the noodle bar. He told her it was nice meeting someone else who understood the misery of the corporate grind and wished her luck with the data redistribution. As Arthur turned toward the exit, the ambient neon lighting of the noodle bar flickered and died. The ambient chatter of the exhausted workers ground to a halt. A heavy, unnatural silence descended over the establishment, broken only by the sound of the rain outside and a low, resonant hum vibrating through the floorboards. Elysia's combat subroutines activated instantly, flooding her system with adrenaline and kinetic potential. Her optical interface flared crimson, detecting 4 rapidly approaching thermal signatures moving through the alleyway outside with impossible speed. Silas had found her, and the violence of the upper echelon was about to crash directly into Arthur Penhaligon's painfully ordinary life. The front window of the Neon Lotus did not simply shatter. It exploded inward in a concussive wave of aerosolized glass and predatory chromium. The blast ripped the cheap neon sign from its moorings, plunging the cramped subterranean noodle bar into a strobing, chaotic nightmare of sparking wires and terrified screams. Through the ruined entryway stepped 4 null hounds, their carbon fiber plating slick with chemical rain. They did not bark or snarl. They moved with a terrifying synchronized silence, their thermal optic clusters sweeping the room until all four locked directly onto the booth Arthur had just vacated. Behind them, stepping over the threshold with heavy, augmented strides, came three of Lord Silas's elite strike operatives, clad in matte black urban armor. Their objective was brutally clear: slaughter the human pet, humiliate the Queen, and leave a message written in blood across Sector 4. Arthur was frozen halfway to the door, a physical credit chip still pinched between his fingers. He stared at the mechanical monstrosities, his brain violently rejecting the reality of military-grade death machines tracking mud onto the sticky linoleum of his favorite lunch spot. The lead operative raised a heavy plasma caster, the weapon whining as its magnetic coils rapidly charged, aiming dead center at Arthur's chest. Elysia moved. She did not run. Running was a human concept. She simply ceased to occupy the space by the table and violently manifested in the trajectory of the plasma bolt. The cheap synthetic polymer jacket she wore disintegrated instantly, unable to withstand the sudden massive spike in her biokinetic output. The disguise burned away in a flash of localized ozone, revealing the liquid midnight of her armored formal gown beneath, her subdermal wiring flaring with a brilliant, terrifying blue light. She caught the superheated plasma bolt with her bare hand. The ambient temperature in the room spiked. Elysia crushed the sphere of volatile energy, channeling its destructive force directly into her own biomagnetic field. She released the absorbed kinetic energy in a devastating, localized shockwave. The invisible force slammed into the lead operative, caving in his reinforced chest plate and sending him flying backward through the ruined window and out into the rain-slicked alleyway. Arthur dropped his credit chip. He fell backward over a plastic stool, landing hard on the damp floorboards as a secondary explosion of hot broth and synthetic noodles rained down upon him. The Null Hounds attacked. Two of them lunged at Elysia, razor-sharp metallic jaws snapping shut with enough hydraulic force to shear through solid steel. Elysia sidestepped the first, her hand flashing out to grip the machine by its articulated neck. With a brutal, fluid twist of her hips, she ripped the hound's head cleanly from its chassis, showering the floor in vital synthetic fluids and sparking hydraulic lines. The second hound pinned her right arm, its claws digging into the floorboards for leverage. The remaining two operatives raised their weapons, acquiring a target lock on the Queen. Elysia's eyes bled from deep brown to a luminous predatory crimson. She tapped into the localized magnetic grid of the sector. The metal support beams of the Neon Lotus groaned in loud protest. She violently reversed the magnetic polarity around the operatives. Their heavy, augmented weaponry was instantly yanked from their grasps, flying across the room to smash heavily into the far wall, before the disarmed assassins could draw their monomolecular blades. Elysia drove her knee upward into the chassis of the hound, pinning her arm, shattering its primary logic core. She discarded the twitching machine, blurred across the room, and delivered two precise, bone-crushing strikes to the operative's temples. They crumpled to the floor, their neural implants completely overwhelmed by the kinetic trauma. The entire engagement had lasted exactly 7 seconds. Silence slammed back into the noodle bar, broken only by the hiss of severed power lines and the steady dripping of spilled soup. The surviving patrons were huddled under their tables, completely paralyzed by shock. Elysia stood amidst the wreckage, her breathing perfectly even, not a single hair out of place. She turned slowly to look at Arthur. The facade of the awkward accounting assistant was entirely gone, replaced by the apex predator of Neo Verona. Arthur sat in a puddle of spilled ramen. He slowly wiped a limp, synthetic noodle from his shoulder. He looked at the smoking crater where the front door used to be, then looked at the violently dismembered combat drones. And finally, He looked down at his ruined, broth-soaked gray corporate slacks. He let out a long, ragged exhale. He loudly complained that those were his only good pair of uniform pants and that dry cleaning in Sector 4 cost more than his weekly food budget. He tapped his wrist chronometer, a look of profound, genuine panic crossing his face. He announced to the room at large, and specifically to the Immortal Sovereign standing over a pile of broken bodies, that Henderson was absolutely going to fire him for this. Elysia stared at him, experiencing a rare moment of complete cognitive stalling. She had just revealed herself as an immortal, biomagnetically augmented killer, and the human at her feet was agonizing over a municipal dress code and a middle management reprimand. Her internal threat sensors flared again. The local transit grid was lighting up. Silas was deploying secondary squads. The noodle bar was no longer defensible, and the longer they stayed in the subterranean claustrophobia of Sector 4, the higher the probability of a stray plasma round destroying her only hope for a cure. She crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing Arthur by the collar of his damp shirt and hauling him to his feet with effortless, terrifying strength. She informed him that his employment status at the municipal logistics firm was officially the least of his concerns. Arthur protested, trying to smooth down his ruined shirt, arguing that she clearly did not understand the ruthless nature of municipal bureaucracy. Elysia ignored him, dragging him toward the rear exit of the kitchen. They burst out into a narrow, trash-strewn maintenance alleyway. The rain was falling harder now, washing away the scent of ozone and burning circuitry. Above them, the sky tore open. The air distorted violently as a sleek, matte black aerodynamic craft dropped its active camouflage. It was a Royal Interceptor, a heavily armed stealth vessel typically reserved for orbital strikes, now hovering mere feet above the overflowing dumpsters of the lower city. The downdraft from its repulsor engine sent garbage flying in miniature cyclones. A side hatch hissed open, revealing a pristine, starkly illuminated interior. Elysia did not wait for Arthur to climb aboard. She shoved him unceremoniously through the hatch, leaping in right behind him as the door sealed shut, instantly cutting off the noise of the rain and the sirens beginning to wail in the distance. Arthur stumbled into a high-backed leather crash seat, his eyes wide as he took in the glowing holographic interface panels and the weapons lockers lining the bulkhead. He scrambled to buckle himself in, his hands shaking slightly, though whether from the adrenaline of a near-death experience or the sudden, extreme luxury of his surroundings, Elysia could not tell. She took the pilot's seat, her hands flying across the tactile controls. She bypassed the municipal flight lane restrictions entirely, engaging the primary thrusters. The interceptor rocketed upward at a punishing angle. Arthur was pinned to his seat, his face contorting under the sudden immense pull of gravitational forces. He managed to wheeze out a question, demanding to know if this was standard procedure for the data redistribution department. Elysia did not smile, but a sharp edge of amusement cut through the tension in her chest. She pushed the throttle forward. The craft punched through the dense, toxic smog layer of the lower city, bursting into the brilliant, blindingly clear stratosphere above. Below them, Neo Verona was a sprawling stain of neon and industrial runoff. Ahead of them, floating in the pristine, manufactured twilight of the upper atmosphere, was the apex spire. It was a massive, floating fortress of glass and steel, heavily fortified by orbital defense platforms and surrounded by a swarm of loyalist patrol drones. It was the absolute epicenter of immortal power, a place where a fragile human had exactly 0 chance of survival without protection. Arthur stared out the viewport, the reflection of the orbital station glowing in his widened eyes. The reality of his situation was finally overriding his concerns about middle management. He was no longer just an underpaid data archivist. He was a captive of the Sanguis elite, dragged into a world where molecular blades and biomagnetic warfare were the standard methods of negotiation. Elysia engaged the automated docking sequence. the heavy magnetic clamps of her private hangar bay catching the interceptor and pulling it into the sterile, brilliantly lit belly of the Spire. Silas would undoubtedly leverage the incident at the noodle bar, spinning her actions as erratic and dangerous to the Immortal Council. The political fallout would be catastrophic, and she had effectively just started a shadow war within her own city. But as she unbuckled her harness and looked back at the terrified, broth-stained human sitting in her stealth craft, she knew it was a war she had to fight. She had the key to their salvation right in front of her, but unlocking it would require breaking every rule she had upheld for 4 centuries. The sterile, ozone-scented air of the Apex Spire tasted like bottled lightning, a sharp contrast to the damp misery of Sector 4. Arthur stepped out of the stealth interceptor and immediately realized his municipal health plan did not cover abduction by an armored deity. Elysia strode ahead, the heavy blast doors of the hangar bay parting silently at her approach. She led him through corridors woven from smart glass and polished obsidian, the architecture defying gravity with sweeping arches that held back the vacuum of the upper stratosphere. Arthur trailed behind, his waterlogged sneakers squeaking aggressively on the pristine, spotless flooring. He felt acutely aware of the lingering aroma of synthetic beef radiating from his shirt. They entered a vast circular chamber that served as Elysia's private sanctum. A holographic projection of the city rotated slowly in the center of the room, bathing the space in a cool sapphire glow. Medical bays, sealed behind transparent kinetic barriers, lined the far wall. Elysia turned to face him, the ambient light catching the sharp angles of her pale features. She gestured for him to sit on a sleek, medical diagnostic bed. Arthur complied, eyeing the array of surgical lasers suspended from the ceiling. He asked if she was going to drain his blood and leave him in a ditch, adding that he would prefer a heads-up so he could cancel his internet subscription. Elysia did not laugh. She walked over to a console, her fingers dancing across the glowing interface. She told him to discard the bedtime stories of his childhood. There were no bats, no aversion to garlic, and no supernatural curses. She explained that the sanguis were the product of a late 21st century vanity project, a desperate bid by the ultra-wealthy to cheat death using self-replicating medical nanites. The holograms in the center of the room shifted, displaying a towering double helix structure. Elysia pointed to it, her voice taking on the detached tone of a university lecturer. She detailed how the nanites repaired cellular damage, halted aging, and provided enhanced kinetic abilities, but required a highly specific synthesized human protein chain to fuel their microscopic engines. Arthur swung his legs nervously against the side of the bed. He noted that they were essentially extremely high-maintenance mosquitoes with a superiority complex. Elysia shot him a withering glare, though the corner of her mouth twitched. She stepped closer, the sapphire light illuminating the sudden, profound exhaustion in her eyes. She explained that the system was breaking down. After 4 centuries of constant replication, the nanite code was accumulating microscopic copy errors. They called it the fading. The sanguis were experiencing systemic cellular degradation, creeping paranoia, and eventual violent insanity. She tapped the console again. The double helix dissolved, replaced by Arthur's own entirely unremarkable municipal medical file. Elysia revealed that he was a statistical impossibility. He was the direct descendant of a forgotten, undocumented control group from the original nanite trials. Buried deep within his bone marrow was a dormant, mutant enzyme. It was a biological stabilizer, a perfect patch for their failing code. He was the only human alive possessing the exact genetic key to stop the sanguis from tearing Neo-Verona apart in a cannibalistic frenzy. Arthur stared at his own medical file, digesting the information. He rubbed the back of his neck, processing the sheer weight of her words. He stated that he was a middle manager's punching bag who ate discounted noodles, not a messiah. He asked why Silas, the man who had just blown up his favorite restaurant, wanted to kill the only cure. Elysia moved to his side. She explained that Silas did not want a cure. He wanted a war. The fading was driving his purist faction to believe they should enslave humanity and consume raw, unfiltered plasma to survive. If Silas knew Arthur possessed the stabilizing enzyme, he would dissect Arthur to synthesize a monopoly on sanity, ruling the remaining Sanguis as a tyrant. She looked down at him, the cold, untouchable sovereign melting away to reveal a desperate survivor. She needed a blood sample, completely pure and extracted directly from the source, to synthesize a temporary serum that would stabilize her own failing system. Arthur swallowed hard, the reality of his situation settling heavily in his chest. He looked at the array of terrifying medical equipment. He offered his arm, telling her to take what she needed, provided she could guarantee he would be back in time for his morning shift. Elysia shook her head. She explained that a standard needle extraction would contaminate the sample with atmospheric oxidization. The enzyme was highly volatile. The extraction required a localized biomagnetic sink, a direct interface between her nanites and his circulatory system. She stepped between his knees. The sudden physical proximity was entirely unexpected, sending a jolt of pure adrenaline through Arthur's system. Elysia was taller than him, her presence overwhelming, smelling of ozone and expensive cold metal. She reached out, her cool fingertips resting gently against the rapid pulse at the base of his throat. Arthur froze. The sarcastic defense mechanisms he relied on to navigate his miserable existence evaporated. He was suddenly acutely aware of how fragile he was. A bag of water and anxiety sitting inches away from a bioengineered apex predator. Elysia leaned in, her eyes locking onto his. The crimson hue of her combat subroutines faded, returning to a deep, dark brown. She whispered a quiet assurance, promising that the pain would be minimal. She closed the distance, her lips brushing softly against the skin over his carotid artery. Arthur gasped, his hands instinctively gripping the edge of the medical bed. He expected fangs. He expected tearing flesh. Instead, he felt a sharp, localized pinch, followed immediately by a surge of incredible electric warmth. Elysia's nanites interfaced directly with his bloodstream through microscopic biomagnetic tethers. The transfer was instantaneous and profoundly intimate. Arthur felt a rush of raw data flooding his senses, a fleeting, dizzying glimpse into centuries of memories, cold wars, and crushing loneliness. Simultaneously, Elysia gasped, her body shuddering as the pure, stabilizing enzyme flooded her failing system. The perpetual agonizing ache in her bones vanished, replaced by a surge of vibrant, chaotic biological energy that she had not felt in 400 years. She pulled back slowly, her breath catching in her throat. A single tiny drop of blood beaded on his neck. She wiped it away with her thumb, her expression stripped of all its usual hardened armor. For the first time, she looked at him not as a biological asset or a fascinating anomaly, but as a man. The sheer vulnerability of his mortal life, his capacity for endurance despite having zero power, struck her with the force of a kinetic blast. Arthur looked up at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He managed a shaky breath, attempting to resurrect his humor. He told her that was significantly better than the municipal flu shot, though the bedside manner could use some work. A genuine smile finally broke across Elysia's face, illuminating the room brighter than the holographic displays. The moment was instantly annihilated by the shrieking wail of a primary breach alarm. The cool sapphire lighting of the sanctum violently shifted to a strobing, aggressive red. The blast doors sealed shut with a heavy metallic clang. Arthur jumped off the bed, his momentary bravery completely erased by the sudden chaos. Elysia spun around, her smile vanishing, instantly replaced by the terrifying, cold calculation of a sovereign under siege. She rushed to the primary console, her fingers flying across the haptic interfaces as warning banners flooded the holographic projection. The external firewalls of the apex spire were collapsing. A massive, distorted holographic bust of Lord Silas materialized in the center of the room, overriding the city display. His face was twisted into a triumphant, predatory sneer. The ambient audio of the sanctum cracked as his voice echoed off the obsidian walls. Silas mocked her, declaring that her pathetic infatuation with a lower city pet had finally blinded her. He announced that he had traced the unique energy spike of her stealth craft directly to the orbital spire. He held up a data pad, displaying a stream of encrypted genetic readouts. He had analyzed the blood left behind by her ruptured combat synthetics at the noodle bar. He knew exactly what Arthur was. Elysia clamped a hand down on the console, her knuckles turning white. She demanded Silas withdraw his forces immediately, citing the ancient treaties of the High Council. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound of grinding metal. He informed her the High Council was currently convening for an emergency session. He was preparing to broadcast the security footage of her prioritizing a single human life over the safety of the Sanguis elite, framing her as a traitor hoarding the cure for herself. He declared that her reign was over, and the era of the purists had begun. The transmission cut out, leaving the room bathed in the urgent, strobing red light of the breach alarms. The floor vibrated beneath their feet as heavy ordnance impacted the spire's external kinetic shielding. Silas was not just launching a political coup. He was bringing down the entire orbital fortress. Arthur looked at Elysia, the terrifying reality of their situation fully dawning on him. They were trapped thousands of feet above the city in a falling glass castle, surrounded by an army of immortal assassins, and his blood was the prize they were all willing to burn the world to acquire. The apex spire was designed to withstand a localized nuclear strike, but it was never built to survive a betrayal from within. As the polished obsidian floor beneath them violently pitched to a 30-degree angle, Arthur realized his aggressively average life was officially over. Explosions hammered the exterior kinetic shielding, sending violent shockwaves through the grand chamber. Elysia did not waste a fraction of a second mourning her fractured sanctuary. She grabbed Arthur by the wrist, her grip like a steel vice, and hauled him toward the rear of the sanctum. The holographic city display flickered and died, plunging the room into a chaotic strobe of emergency crimson lighting. She punched a frantic sequence into a hidden biometric panel on the wall, revealing a narrow, cylindrical alcove containing a sleek, titanium emergency drop pod. Arthur balked, staring at the claustrophobic metal coffin. He shouted over the deafening roar of collapsing architecture that he was severely claustrophobic, and that municipal health guidelines strictly prohibited putting employees in unventilated tubes. Elysia shoved him inside without a shred of sympathy. She crowded in right behind him, the space so tight their chests were pressed together. She slammed her hand against the deployment override just as the heavy blast doors of her sanctum buckled inward, giving way to a swarm of heavily augmented purist shock troops. The pod hatch sealed. The world outside vanished. Gravity ceased to exist for one terrifying, weightless second. Then, the explosive bolts sheared away, and the pod plummeted. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping the restraints so hard his knuckles turned white. The descent was a brutal, bone-rattling nightmare of intense gravitational pressure. They were free-falling from the stratosphere, tearing through the pristine upper atmosphere, punching through the toxic yellow smog layer of the lower city, and diving straight toward the bedrock. The pod's ablative shielding burned bright against the friction, the internal temperature spiking uncomfortably. Elysia monitored the telemetry on a small, flickering heads-up display. She announced they could not risk a surface landing. as Silas would have the entire city grid locked down and flooded with tracking drones. They were going deep. They were bypassing the lower sectors entirely and aiming for the forgotten, irradiated ruins of old Earth beneath Neo-Verona. Arthur opened one eye, his stomach doing frantic gymnastics. He asked if she meant the toxic, structurally unstable graveyard full of mutant scavengers and ancient, unexploded ordnance. He quickly added that he only knew about it because he filed the municipal reports for the sinkholes it caused. Elysia confirmed his fears with a single grim nod. The pod hit the subterranean crust with the force of a meteor. Retro rockets fired at the very last possible millisecond, turning a fatal impact into a violently bruising crash. The titanium cylinder tore through layers of forgotten concrete, rusted steel beams, and subterranean water mains before finally grinding to a halt in absolute darkness. Silence rushed in, heavy and suffocating. Arthur gasped for breath, his chest aching from the harness. He unbuckled himself, his hands shaking violently. He asked if they were dead, stating that if this was the afterlife, the corporate HR department had severely misrepresented the accommodations. Elysia kicked the primary release lever. The hatch blew outward with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a landscape of total crushing despair. They had landed in an ancient cavernous subway terminal. The air was thick, tasting of heavy metals, ancient dust, and decay. Bioluminescent fungi clung to the collapsed ceilings, casting a sickly pale green glow over mountains of rusted debris and petrified train cars. It was a tomb of the 21st century, buried and forgotten by the immortal architects above. Elysia stepped out of the pod, her liquid midnight gown torn and coated in gray ash. She raised her hand, attempting to summon a localized biomagnetic sphere to light their path. Nothing happened. She frowned, her eyes flashing crimson as she tried to tap into her combat subroutines. A sharp, localized spark arched across her collarbone, and she let out a sudden gasp of genuine pain, falling to one knee. Arthur scrambled out of the pod, entirely forgetting his panic. He rushed to her side, offering his shoulder. He asked what was wrong, genuine concern overriding his usual sarcasm. Elysia leaned heavily against him, her breathing ragged. She looked at her trembling hands. The ambient radiation of the ruins, combined with the dense, chaotic magnetic interference from millions of miles of unshielded, decaying copper wiring, was completely scrambling her nanites. Her abilities were suppressed. Her immense kinetic strength was gone. For the first time in 400 years, the immortal queen of Neo-Verona was experiencing physical weakness. She looked up at Arthur, her voice stripped of its usual commanding resonance. She confessed that she was blind, mathematically speaking, cut off from the global grid and entirely vulnerable. Arthur looked around the terrifying, cavernous ruins. He adjusted his glasses, a strange sense of calm washing over him. The apex spire was an alien world of glass and violence, but this damp, miserable, structurally deficient nightmare was familiar territory. He looked at a rusted, barely legible sign hanging diagonally from a collapsed pillar. He recognized the alphanumeric code instantly. He spent 10 hours a day archiving the architectural history of these exact forgotten transit lines, sorting through the corrupt data of the old world to ensure the new world did not accidentally dig into a sinkhole. He knew exactly where they were. He helped Elysia to her feet, wrapping her arm securely over his shoulder. He told her not to worry. He announced that while he might be useless in a high-tech orbital gunfight, navigating structurally unsound municipal disasters was literally his area of expertise. The dynamic of power inverted completely. The apex predator was now reliant on the aggressively average data clerk. Arthur guided them away from the wreckage of the drop pod, knowing Silas's sensors would eventually pinpoint the impact crater. He led her down the collapsed subway tunnels, his mind projecting a perfect three-dimensional map of the archaic transit grid over the rusted ruins. He knew which tunnels were flooded with toxic runoff, which sections were prone to cave-ins, and exactly where the old maintenance shafts connected to the secondary power grids. They walked for hours through the suffocating dark. The damp cold seeped into their bones. Elysia stumbled often, her perfectly engineered muscles struggling to carry her own weight without the aid of her biomagnetic stabilizers. Arthur never complained. He held her steady, his calloused hands providing the only warmth in the irradiated graveyard. He kept up a steady stream of mundane chatter to distract her from the pain, detailing the bizarre history of the municipal zoning laws and the intricacies of his pension plan. Elysia found herself listening intently, clinging to the sound of his voice. She realized that her immortal society had spent centuries engineering out all discomfort, creating a sterile, stagnant perfection. In doing so, they had completely lost the capacity for endurance. Arthur was fragile, entirely mortal and terrified, yet he simply kept moving forward, adapting to the misery with dry humor and sheer, stubborn willpower. As they rounded a corner into a massive, flooded junction station, Arthur suddenly stopped, pulling Elysia behind a rusted pillar. He clamped a hand over her mouth. Across the black, stagnant water of the junction, shadows were moving, or they were pale, contorted figures, moving with twitchy, feral desperation. These were the scavengers, descendants of the humans left behind during the construction of Neo-Verona, heavily mutated by centuries of subterranean radiation. They were blind, hunting entirely by sound and vibration. Elysia instinctively reached for a weapon she did not have, her body tensing for a kinetic strike she could no longer deliver. Arthur pressed her back against the pillar. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the physical credit chip from the noodle bar, along with a heavy, rusted bolt he had picked up earlier. He pointed toward a cluster of ancient, exposed electrical transformers hanging dangerously over the far side of the water. With a practiced, completely unheroic throw, Arthur hurled the rusted bolt across the cavern. It struck the ancient metal casing of the transformer with a loud, ringing clamor. The feral scavengers instantly shrieked, splashing violently into the water and rushing blindly toward the source of the noise. Arthur grabbed Elysia's hand, pulling her in the opposite direction. He guided her up a crumbling maintenance stairwell, slipping through a rusted access door just as the scavengers swarmed the empty shoreline below. They collapsed on the grating of a high catwalk, chests heaving. Elysia looked at Arthur, completely astonished. She noted that he had just defeated a pack of apex subterranean predators with a piece of garbage and an accounting token. Arthur leaned his head back against the rusted railing, catching his breath. He stated that middle management taught him the most valuable lesson of survival, which was to always redirect the hostility toward another department. Elysia let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a beautiful sound, completely out of place in the grim darkness of the Undercity. She looked at his hand, still tightly gripping hers. She did not pull away. The shared vulnerability had stripped away the centuries of emotional armor she wore. She realized that she did not just want Arthur for his genetic anomaly. She wanted him for his humanity. Arthur looked at her, his expression softening. He pointed down the catwalk toward a heavy reinforced steel bulkhead. He explained that behind those doors was an old, hard-wired relay station. It was one of the few places in the Undercity that still possessed a physical fiber optic connection to the upper levels, buried too deep for Silas to sever. If they could reach it, Elysia could interface with the network and broadcast her survival directly to the Immortal High Council. They stood up, the goal finally within reach. But as Arthur reached out to turn the heavy locking wheel of the bulkhead, The steel door abruptly violently buckled outward. A massive armored hand punched straight through the reinforced steel, grabbing Arthur by the throat and lifting him effortlessly into the air. The heavy metal doors were ripped entirely off their hinges, revealing a squad of elite, heavily augmented purist trackers standing in the shadows of the relay station. Silas had not just tracked the drop pod, he had anticipated their destination. They were entirely cut off, and Arthur was suffocating in the grip of a machine. Being choked by a 2-ton cyborg in a radioactive basement was definitively worse than dealing with middle management. Though the complete lack of mandatory paperwork was a minor consolation, the world faded to a fuzzy, oxygen-deprived gray as the augmented purist lifted Arthur higher into the stagnant air. Completely ignoring his frantic attempts to pry the metal fingers from his windpipe, Elysia threw herself forward, her instincts demanding a lethal kinetic strike that her suppressed nanites simply could not deliver. Her fist connected with the cyborg's reinforced chassis, yielding nothing but a dull thud and a sharp flare of agony in her knuckles. A second tracker stepped from the shadows, swinging a heavy electromagnetic baton. The blow caught Elysia squarely in the ribs, sending a massive, incapacitating surge of disruptive voltage through her already failing system. She collapsed, gasping, her vision swimming in a sea of static. The trackers did not offer monologues or gloat. They simply slapped heavy localized magnetic inhibitors onto Elysia's wrists, tossed Arthur to the floor like a discarded food wrapper, and dragged them both toward a waiting extraction transport. The journey back to the surface was a blurred, concussive nightmare. Arthur faded in and out of consciousness, his throat a ring of purple bruises, his lungs burning with every breath. When the heavy doors of the transport finally hissed open, the suffocating darkness of the Undercity was gone, replaced by the blinding, sterile perfection of the apex spire. They were hauled into the grand amphitheater of the Immortal High Council. The chamber was a colossal masterpiece of acoustic engineering and white marble, designed to make anyone standing in the center feel profoundly insignificant. Tiered seating spiraled upward, filled with hundreds of the Sanguis elite. They wore garments of spun light and woven platinum, their faces masks of pristine, ageless beauty. Yet, beneath the veneer of absolute power, Arthur could see the subtle, terrifying signs of the fading. The Immortals possessed a manic, predatory edge. Their eyes darted nervously. Some had a faint, uncontrollable tremor in their hands. They were a society of gods slowly going mad, and they were desperately hungry for a scapegoat. Lord Silas stood at the central podium, bathed in a harsh, theatrical spotlight. He wore an immaculate military uniform adorned with the ancient crests of the purist faction. He raised his hands, and the murmuring of the elite instantly died down to a hushed, expectant silence. Silas pointed a single, perfectly manicured finger at the center of the floor. Elysia and Arthur had been thrown roughly onto the polished marble. Elysia's liquid midnight gown was torn and coated in radioactive ash. She was bleeding from a cut above her eye, a sight that sent a ripple of collective shock through the gathered Immortals. Sanguis did not bleed unless their nanites were critically compromised. Silas pitched his voice perfectly, letting it echo off the marble walls with the tragic gravitas of a betrayed patriot. He announced to the council that their sovereign had abandoned them. He gestured to Elysia, weaving a masterful, devastating lie. He claimed his intelligence division had uncovered her darkest secret. She had discovered a genetic stabilizer, a cure for the fading that was ravaging their minds and bodies. But instead of sharing this salvation, she had chosen to hoard it. He pointed accusingly at Arthur, labeling the bruised, terrified human as a walking biological reservoir that the Queen intended to keep exclusively for herself, ensuring she would rule as the sole sane immortal over a court of raving lunatics. A wave of visceral, terrifying anger washed over the amphitheater. The Sanguis hissed, their fangs subtly descending. The paranoia induced by their degrading nanites made them the perfect audience for Silas's conspiracy. Elysia forced herself to her feet. The magnetic inhibitors clamped to her wrists were heavy, constantly flooding her nervous system with agonizing white noise. But her posture remained flawless. She was stripped of her kinetic power, dressed in rags and facing execution. Yet she commanded the room the moment she lifted her chin. She met Silas's gaze with absolute, chilling contempt. She raised her voice, letting the sheer force of her centuries of authority cut through the rising panic of the crowd. She accused Silas of projecting his own treacherous ambitions onto her. She demanded to know how a purist warlord, who had spent the last century advocating for the mass slaughter of the human population, suddenly possessed such intimate, complex knowledge of human genetics and nanite stabilization protocols. Silas sneered, clearly irritated that she was not cowering. He fired back, twisting her words, turning the debate into a vicious, high-speed verbal spar over the technicalities of the ancient concordat. Elysia kept pushing, dissecting his arguments, demanding he produce the raw data of his so-called intelligence reports. She was brilliantly, aggressively stalling. She knew she could not fight her way out of the chamber. But she also knew the man kneeling behind her possessed a very specific set of skills perfectly suited for bureaucratic warfare. Arthur remained on his knees, his hands bound tightly behind his back with heavy-duty municipal zip cuffs. The purist trackers had thoroughly disarmed Elysia, but they had made a fatal, arrogant assumption about Arthur. They viewed humans as entirely primitive, biological livestock. They did not bother to search him for technology, assuming he lacked the intellect to use it. They had missed the heavily modified, cracked-screen municipal data pad tucked firmly into the waistband of his ruined trousers at the small of his back. It was a cheap, bulky piece of corporate junk he used to illegally bypass municipal paywalls to watch vintage movies during his lunch breaks. Right now, it was the most dangerous weapon in the room. Arthur contorted his shoulders, fighting through the sharp pain in his bruised ribs. He walked his bound fingers down his spine, blindly gripping the edges of the datapad. He activated the device by pressing the power sequence against his belt buckle. The screen warmed against his lower back. He could not see the interface. He had to rely entirely on muscle memory, honed by 10,000 hours of mind-numbing data entry in a windowless cubicle. His thumbs flew across the tactile glass surface, bringing up a localized network scanner. The security grid of the High Council was legendary. It was an impenetrable fortress of overlapping quantum-encrypted firewalls designed to repel dedicated cyber warfare divisions. However, that was only true from the outside. Internally, the system was a complete disaster. The Immortals despised change. They had built their glorious floating spire on top of the original municipal routing protocols established centuries ago, simply piling new, shiny security layers over ancient, decaying foundations. To an Immortal slicing through the upper echelons of the network, it looked like a titanium vault. To a municipal data archivist who spent his entire miserable existence fixing the legacy spaghetti code of the city's underbelly, it had a back door the size of a freight elevator. Arthur's thumbs tapped furiously. He initiated a handshake protocol with the room's ambient lighting grid, a system classified as zero threat. From there, he daisy-chained his connection into the environmental controls, routing his datapad signal through a simulated overdue municipal tax filing loop. The ancient underlying architecture of the Council's network recognized the municipal tax code as a supreme, overriding priority. The firewalls simply parted for him. He was in. Elysia was still holding the floor, her voice ringing out as she mercilessly picked apart Silas's timeline of events. Silas was growing visibly furious, his hands gripping the edges of his podium so tightly the marble began to crack under his augmented strength. He signaled to his elite guards, ordering them to ready their plasma rifles. The stall was coming to an end. Arthur ignored the hum of the weapons charging around him. He drove deep into the local data traffic, searching for Silas's personal command node. He found it shielded behind a dense layer of biometric encryption. Arthur bypassed it entirely by exploiting a known bug in the archaic calendar syncing software Silas's node was tethered to. The files unlocked, pouring into Arthur's datapad. He scanned the text streams rushing across the cracked screen against his back, interpreting the raw code through touch and rapid tactile feedback. What he found made the blood freeze in his veins. The fading was not a natural decay. It was not a tragic consequence of centuries of cellular replication. It was a manufactured crisis. Silas had engineered it. Buried deep in his private ledgers were receipts for illegal biotech facilities and deployment schedules dating back over a century. Silas had commissioned the creation of a microscopic logic bomb, a tiny, undetectable virus spliced into the synthesized plasma supply of the upper elite. It was designed to slowly, methodically degrade the nanites of his political rivals, driving them mad and paving the way for a purist coup. Even worse, the files contained the formula for a rudimentary, heavily toxic buffer serum Silas had been secretly taking to protect himself from the very plague he unleashed. Arthur had the proof. He had the definitive evidence to shatter Silas's lie and save Elysia's life. He had the power to prevent a genocidal war that would burn Neo-Verona to the ground. He prepped the files for a mass external broadcast, formatting the data packets to override the primary holovids lining the grand amphitheater. He primed the execution command, his thumb hovering blindly over the cracked screen. But as the guards raised their weapons, their targeting lasers painting a dozen red dots across Elysia's chest, Arthur realized a fatal flaw in his plan. The archaic local network required a massive surge of bandwidth to push a broadcast of that size past the final internal dampeners. His cheap, smuggled datapad simply did not have the processing power to force the upload before the guards pulled their triggers. He was locked in a digital bottleneck, holding the truth in his bound hands while the executioners took aim. Arthur had the digital equivalent of a nuclear payload sitting on his lower back, but he was trying to push it through a garden hose. The targeting lasers of the purist execution squad burned bright red against Elysia's torn gown, signaling the end of her 4-century reign. He needed an amplifier, a massive surge of bandwidth to force the data packets through the archaic security bottleneck. His thumbs danced blindly over the cracked glass of his datapad, desperately searching the local network topology for a vulnerability. He found it in the amphitheater's localized anti-gravity field generators. The council used them purely for theatrical effect, to make the floating podiums of the elite appear weightless. Arthur initiated a catastrophic, completely illegal municipal override, commanding the generators to draw maximum power while simultaneously reversing their polarity. The grand amphitheater plunged into pitch blackness as the primary power grid failed under the sudden, massive strain. A split second later, the backup generators kicked in, and the digital bottleneck shattered. Every massive holographic display in the chamber, every smart glass window, and every personal datapad carried by the Sanguis elite suddenly blazed to life. The broadcast did not stop there. It cascaded through the fiber-optic pipelines, flooding the entire city grid. High above in the pristine upper atmosphere and deep below in the smog-choked alleys of Sector 4, the ubiquitous neon advertisements and transit schedules were instantly overwritten. Silas's encrypted ledgers scrolled across the sky in massive, undeniable text. Audio logs echoed off the white marble of the council chamber, playing Silas's own arrogant, highly classified voice memos. The recording detailed the precise deployment schedule of a microscopic logic bomb virus into the synthesized plasma supply. It outlined his meticulous plan to artificially induce the fading, weaponizing cellular decay to drive his political rivals insane while he safely consumed a secret buffer serum. The silence that followed the broadcast was heavier than the gravity of the room. The targeting lasers vanished from Elysia's chest. The elite purist guards lowered their weapons, turning their visors slowly toward the central podium. The hundreds of immortals filling the tiered seating stared at the holographic evidence, their pristine faces twisting from paranoia into absolute, unadulterated rage. The madness ravaging their minds and bodies was not a tragic biological inevitability. It was an assassination. Silas stood frozen at the podium, the harsh white light of his own exposed treason reflecting in his eyes. He calculated his political survival odds and found them completely zero. He did not attempt to negotiate or offer a silver-tongued defense. He simply roared in fury and slammed his fist down onto a hidden biometric panel embedded in the marble structure. The podium violently fractured. The floor beneath Silas split open as a concealed, heavily armored combat mech suit deployed from a subterranean vault. It was a hulking monstrosity of matte black carbon steel, bristling with illegal military-grade plasma vents and hydraulic servos. The suit enveloped him, locking into his neural implants with a sickening crunch of integrating metal. The sheer power draw of the illegal war machine deploying sent a localized electromagnetic shockwave rippling through the center of the room. The heavy magnetic inhibitors clamped to Elysia's wrists sparked violently, their internal circuitry completely fried by the pulse. The heavy metal bands popped open, falling uselessly to the marble floor. Elysia rolled her shoulders. The crimson hue flooded back into her eyes, burning brighter than before. Her nanites, still thoroughly supercharged by the pure enzyme she had extracted from Arthur, sang with violent kinetic potential. Silas leveled a massive arm-mounted heavy plasma cannon directly at her. Elysia did not wait for him to fire. She blurred into motion, crossing the distance in a fraction of a second. She drove her fist upward, channeling a localized biomagnetic shockwave directly into the barrel of the plasma cannon just as Silas pulled the trigger. The superheated energy violently backfired, exploding within the weapon's casing and shearing the heavy mechanical arm completely off the suit. Sparks showered the ruined marble as Silas swung his remaining hydraulic arm in a brutal backhand arc. The blow caught Elysia in the shoulder, sending her flying backward to crash heavily into a spiraling stone staircase. Arthur used the chaotic distraction to throw his weight against a jagged piece of shrapnel from the destroyed podium. He sawed his municipal zip cuffs against the sharp edge, ignoring the friction burns tearing at his wrists. The heavy plastic snapped. He pulled his datapad around to the front, his thumbs flying across the interface with renewed desperation. He refused to be a passive observer in a war fought over his own blood. He stayed tapped into the chamber's environmental controls. He was a municipal archivist. He knew how buildings worked, and he knew how to break them. Silas lumbered forward, his heavy metal footfalls cracking the floorboards. He raised his remaining arm, preparing to crush Elysia where she lay. Arthur executed his first command. He localized the anti-gravity field directly beneath Silas's massive metal chassis and dialed it to maximum lift. The warlord was violently yanked 30 feet into the air, his heavy mechanical suit suddenly floating like a helpless balloon. Silas roared, thrashing wildly, unable to gain any kinetic leverage in the zero-gravity bubble. Elysia capitalized instantly. She launched herself off the ruined staircase, soaring into the air to meet him. She delivered a devastating high-speed series of kinetic strikes to the suit's articulated joints, systematically dismantling its armor plating. Armor panels warped and tore away, revealing the vulnerable wiring and the snarling Immortal pilot within. Silas managed to manually override the anti-gravity field from his internal console. The massive suit plummeted back to the floor, cratering the marble upon impact. He stabilized himself, locking his hydraulic anchors into the bedrock and aimed a cluster of shoulder-mounted micro-missiles at Elysia as she landed lightly a dozen yards away. Arthur did not hesitate. He routed a massive power surge directly into the smart glass windows lining the amphitheater and the grand chandeliers above. He programmed a strobe effect, oscillating the light from pitch black to blinding, military-grade solar intensity at a rapid, violently disorienting frequency. The entire chamber became a chaotic, strobing nightmare. Silas's advanced optical sensors tried to compensate, but the rapid shifts from complete darkness to searing light completely overwhelmed the suit's visual processors. The targeting lasers scattered wildly, the micro-missiles firing blindly into the vaulted ceiling and raining harmless debris down upon the empty seating tiers. Blinded and thoroughly disoriented, Silas swung his massive remaining arm in blind, frantic arcs. Elysia moved through the strobing light like a phantom. She slid smoothly under a sweeping hydraulic punch, feeling the displaced air rush over her face. She planted her feet firmly, tapped into the absolute maximum threshold of her biomagnetic potential, and drove her hands straight forward in a concentrated kinetic spear strike. Her hand pierced the weakened armor plating of the mech suit's chest cavity. The force of the blow shattered the primary power core, driving straight through the machinery and directly into Silas's ribcage. The warlord froze. The strobing lights flickered one final time before the system overloaded entirely, leaving the chamber bathed in the soft, natural glow of the planetary twilight filtering through the shattered windows. Silas let out a wet, metallic gasp. The hydraulic servos of his combat suit whined and powered down, locking his massive armored frame into a rigid, kneeling position. Elysia withdrew her hand. The Purist leader slumped forward against his own ruined dashboard, completely motionless. The coup was over. Elysia stood amidst the wreckage of her own throne room, her chest heaving, the liquid midnight of her gown reduced to tatters. She looked across the ruined marble floor to where Arthur sat, a bruised, exhausted human holding a cracked piece of municipal junk that had just brought down an empire. She offered him a faint, genuine smile of pure gratitude, but the silence in the room was not a peaceful one. The massive holographic displays were still looping the decrypted files. Silas's conspiracy was laid bare, but so was the rest of his data. The entire technical breakdown of the genetic anomaly was broadcast in bright, unavoidable emerald text. The exact cellular structure of the stabilizing enzyme, the location of the extraction, and the identity of the carrier were now public knowledge. Arthur slowly lowered the datapad. He felt the sudden, terrifying weight of 1,000 eyes shifting toward him. The Sanguis elite had descended from their tiered seating. They formed a massive, silent circle around the ruined center of the room. They were looking at Silas's corpse with disgust, but they were looking at Arthur with raw, desperate hunger. The truth of the virus had absolved them of their guilt, but it did not cure their condition. The fading was still in their blood, and the only known salvation in the entire world was sitting on the floor in a stained gray shirt. The apex predators of Neo-Verona closed ranks. They did not attack, restrained by the lingering authority of their queen. But the tension was thick enough to shatter glass. The immediate threat of the Purist rebellion had been violently neutralized, but Elysia now faced a far more terrifying challenge. She had to figure out how to protect an aggressively average data clerk from an entire society of dying immortals who knew exactly what his blood was worth. When an immortal society discovers that a single, aggressively average human holds the key to their salvation, the only logical way to keep him off a dissection table is to give him a crown. The silence in the ruined grand amphitheater was absolute, heavy with the predatory tension of hundreds of desperate, dying aristocrats. The Sanguis elite stared at Arthur Penhaligon. They saw the cure for the fading sitting on the cracked marble floor. his gray corporate slacks stained with subterranean mud and ancient, radioactive ash. The madness of the virus was still in their blood, and the primal urge to descend upon him and take the stabilizing enzyme by force warred violently with their ingrained fear of the sovereign standing between them. Elysia did not hesitate. She stepped directly in front of Arthur, shielding him with her own battered body. Her nanites, still fiercely energized by the pure sample of his blood, flared with a brilliant, terrifying azure light that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the ruined chamber. She raised her voice, utilizing her restored biomagnetic amplification to project her words with the concussive force of a physical blow. She declared that the era of hoarding power in the dark was over. She announced that the genetic anomaly within Arthur was not a resource to be fought over, nor a prize to be kept locked in a subterranean laboratory. She formally invoked the most ancient, absolute right of the sovereign throne, a law that had not been utilized since the founding of Neo-Verona. She elevated Arthur Penhaligon, a third-class municipal data archivist with a severely overdrawn bank account, to the official and legally binding position of royal consort. A collective gasp echoed through the tiered seating. The political implications were staggering. By making him her consort, Elysia was permanently binding his life to the crown. Any harm brought to him, any attempt to capture or exploit him, would instantly be classified as high treason against the sovereign herself, punishable by immediate, irreversible kinetic execution. Elysia turned and extended her hand to Arthur. He looked at her perfectly manicured fingers, then up at her face, which was bruised, exhausted, and entirely sincere. He took her hand, letting her pull him to his feet. He dusted off his ruined knees, adjusted his glasses, and looked out at the sea of bewildered, terrifying immortals. He cleared his throat, his voice entirely lacking biomagnetic amplification, but carrying perfectly through the stunned silence. He announced that he accepted the position, on the strict condition that the Apex Spire immediately instituted a mandatory, comprehensive dental plan for all municipal employees in Sector 4, and that someone finally fixed the magnetic rail schedule. The sheer absurd audacity of a fragile human making bureaucratic demands of a society of apex predators broke the tension instantly. Elysia let out a sharp, genuine laugh, the sound ringing clear and bright across the shattered marble. The Sanguis elite, thoroughly exhausted by centuries of paranoia and hours of violent upheaval, simply bowed their heads in begrudging, utterly bewildered submission. The transition of power was swift and entirely devoid of the usual aristocratic bloodshed. Within 48 hours, the sterile, terrifying medical bays of the Apex Spire were repurposed. The elite geneticists of the High Council, who had previously spent their days devising new methods of biological warfare, found themselves tiptoeing nervously around a plush, heated reclining chair. Arthur sat in the center of the laboratory, watching a holovid of a vintage mid-century sitcom while an array of highly advanced, totally non-invasive robotic surgical arms carefully extracted a microscopic sample of his bone marrow. The process was completely painless, utilizing a localized anesthetic field that made his arm feel delightfully warm and fuzzy. The scientist treated him like spun glass, terrified of invoking the wrath of the queen who watched their every move from the observation deck with the hawkish intensity of a protective predator. From that single pure extraction, the geneticist safely and infinitely replicated the stabilizing enzyme. Elysia made good on her promise. She did not hoard the cure. She authorized the mass synthesis of the stabilizer and flooded the municipal plasma supply. The distribution was completely free, fundamentally dismantling the artificial scarcity and fear-mongering that Lord Silas had used to build his purest empire. The fading was halted in its tracks. The creeping insanity vanished from the minds of the Sanguis, leaving behind a profound, sobering clarity regarding how close they had come to tearing their own civilization apart. With the biological crisis averted, Arthur set about dismantling the cultural rot of the upper echelons. He brought the unyielding, relentless power of middle management efficiency to the royal court. He found the Immortals' reliance on dramatic, shadowy assassinations to be highly inefficient. He instituted weekly mandatory performance reviews for the High Council. He forced ancient warlords to use standardized spreadsheets to track their resource allocations. He replaced the cruel, arbitrary punishments of the sanguis with terrifyingly mundane bureaucratic sanctions. Discovering that centuries-old aristocrats feared doing community service in the lower levels far more than they feared the blade. More importantly, his grounded morality began to reshape the city. By elevating a human to the second highest seat of power, Elysia shattered the illusion of human inferiority. Exploitative labor practices in the lower sectors were systematically outlawed. The artificial sunlight quotas were abolished, and the orbital mirrors were realigned to bathe the entire city, not just the apex spire, in warm, natural light. The air scrubbers in Sector 4 were finally repaired, entirely funded by heavy luxury taxes levied against the Immortal synthetic silk imports. A new equilibrium settled over Neo-Verona. The sanguis retained their extended lifespans and their technological marvels, but they were forced to share the world with the humanity they had previously discarded. Yet, even as the city healed, the encrypted broadcast Arthur had unleashed during the coup had slipped past the municipal firewalls. The data was quietly echoing across the global grid, reaching other isolated megacities and hidden Immortal factions, ensuring that the new royal consort would soon have plenty of massive, terrifying problems to file under his growing list of grievances. Months later, far above the newly clean, vibrant streets of the city, Elysia and Arthur stood on a sweeping obsidian balcony. The heavy, toxic smog of the past was entirely gone, replaced by a brilliant, star-filled night sky. Arthur was leaning against the smart glass railing, holding a steaming mug of highly illegal, naturally grown coffee, a luxury imported specifically for him. He looked healthy, the permanent stress of poverty and municipal dread entirely erased from his features, though he still stubbornly wore a slightly wrinkled gray shirt. Elysia stood beside him, her presence still radiating immense quiet power. She reached out, her cool fingers intertwining with his warm hand. She confessed that for 400 years, she had viewed her immortality as the ultimate achievement. She had believed that escaping death meant she had conquered the universe. Arthur took a sip of his coffee, looking out over the glittering lights of the sprawling metropolis. He noted that unlimited time just gives you an excuse to put off making actual decisions. Elysia leaned her head against his shoulder. She realized he was entirely right. The Immortals had built a sterile, stagnant paradise because they had nothing to lose. They had sacrificed their empathy for endless preservation. Arthur's fragile, incredibly brief mortality was not a weakness. It was the very thing that gave his choices weight. His ticking biological clock meant that every laugh, every risk, and every moment of compassion was a deliberate, precious expenditure of a limited resource. A limited lifespan was the only thing that gave love its true, undeniable meaning. She knew she would outlive him, that one day his deeply average, fiercely resilient life would end. But until that day came, she intended to spend every single second fiercely guarding the man who had taught an immortal queen how to actually live. Thank you so much for watching this journey into the neon-drenched world of Neo-Verona. If you enjoyed watching a heavily armed immortal queen fall for an incredibly stressed municipal worker, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more sci-fi adventures. I want to hear from you. So jump into the comments and leave the word noodles to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the story. Do not forget to share this video with your friends and smash that hype button so the algorithm knows to push this story out to more viewers who love a good mix of cyberpunk action and unexpected romance.